Yeah, Akshat, you can start now.
Yeah. Okay. So I hope everyone can just hear me and see the screen, like the
Yeah, yeah,
that I've shared. Right. So my name is Akshat Agarwal, and I'm now a third year student at National Law School. So I just give you a brief about what we're gonna do in this session. What is the series is gonna be about, and then we're just gonna jump into it. We'll discuss today's topic, which is premises and conclusions. Right. So just to brief you a little bit about what we're planning to do here. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you a couple of series of lectures on the very basics of critical reasoning. Now, critical reasoning is a very, as you all know, an important component of CLAT, and more importantly, it's a very scoring subject because, as compared to legal reasoning or your reading comprehension, it's more easier to objectively solve it. You're able to eliminate the wrong options and arrive at a more concrete correct answer as compared to, let's say, RC or legal, because there there's a lot of ambiguity, right? So it's and the key to do that is to just brush up your basics and be clear with the concepts of critical reasoning. So that's what we're going to do. So the first thing which we have is premises and conclusions in critical reasoning. And how this is gonna go is also just if you guys want to unmute or anything, just let me know. Like I, I guess, or just type in your questions in between if you want to. But yeah, okay. So what we're gonna discuss in this lecture is basically what is a premise. Then, how do we identify a premise in a passage? What is a conclusion? How do we identify a conclusion? Then, these are something very peculiar. What is a counter premise? And how do you identify a counter premise in a passage? And then we're going to talk about why is it important to identify premises and conclusions. Now, so you might not have come across these terms from like CLAT papers or something like that. Like they don't directly ask you what is a premise, what is the conclusion, but then it's important to understand what premises and conclusions are, because critical reasoning is a lot about what an argument is, right? Now, the next question then is, what is an argument? So, any argument in critical reasoning is basically a set of premises, and on those premises, you arrive at a conclusion. So a simple equation before you is premise 1 plus premise 2 plus the conclusion makes your argument. Now, if you see in CLAT, generally you'll have passages from, let's say, the Hindu editorials, op-ed pieces, Indian Express opinions, and all these things. So, what are these authors basically doing? They are writing about something, some topic. They have an argument. They say that, okay, I observe that this is happening, therefore I argue or I conclude that this is the case. So we'll pick up a couple of examples as well, and that'll make things more clear. But that's the objective of critical reasoning in general, right? So that you can identify an argument. Now, to break down an argument, it is important to identify what a premise is and what a conclusion is. Now, the kind of questions you see in CLAT are about, okay, how do you strengthen an argument? How do you weaken a statement? What is the assumption underlying, let's say, the author's argument? These are the questions which you might be familiar with if you've, let's say, done a couple of mocks or something like that, right? So, and what goes behind this, so before we get into all of these topics, strengthen, weaken, assumptions, blah blah blah, what is important is that you first understand what a premise or a conclusion is. Because whenever you're strengthening an argument, whenever you are weakening an argument or finding an assumption, what you're basically doing is you're engaging with the premises of that argument or the conclusion of that argument. And to do that, you need to identify what a premise is and you need to identify what a conclusion is, right? So just give me a minute. Uh, okay, so we just jump into what a premise is, right? So basically, a premise is something like this. It's It's like whenever, let's say, you're arguing something, you say that, okay, I think apples are good. You need to back it up with reasons, right? Like, why do you think apple is good? Like, it has like health benefits, blah blah blah, keeps the doctor away, blah blah blah, whatever.
Akshat, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. Are you
Yeah.
changing your slides? Like we have been stuck at the first slide itself.
You still Acha, just a second. Okay.
Yeah.
I did change my slide. Just a
Yeah,
second.
now they're visible.
Now they're visible.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh just give me a sec. Okay, I'm changing the slide. Can you see the change in the slide
Now
now?
I am we are on the slide. What is the premise?
Okay. So you're seeing what is the premise right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Just give me a second.
And I'm seeing this equation also, the equations that you mentioned.
So I think there's a lag here. Wait, um I've stopped sharing. I'll just share my entire screen then. Just a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, wait a second. Okay, can you now see the I'm on this what is the premise slide? I'll just change. Can you see the slide
Yeah.
now? What is the
Yeah.
premise?
I can see this slide. Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Great. Okay, so now we jump into what a premise is. So, like I was saying, when you build an argument, you back it up with reasons. You back it up with something. It could be observations as well. It could be anything, right? And that's what makes an argument. So that is exactly what a premise is. A premise basically is like it could be any facts, it could be any reasons, it could be any evidence. So if you take a look at some the Hindu Express op-eds or editorial opinions, you'll see that they provide a lot of factual data. Like, okay, in general elections, this happened, that happened, blah blah blah, all those things, right? All of that is a premise, right? That's what the author is using to build their argument and then arrive at a conclusion. Okay, so if you look at this is a basic structure which I've given you. Like, the author can say that, okay, A leads to B and B leads to C. Therefore, the author concludes that A also leads to C. It's a very simple analogy, but I think it will make more sense if, let's say, we do a couple of examples. Um, okay, so I want you to read. We have three examples here. Then, can you identify what are the premises of the author and what are the conclusions of the author? So the first example reads: identical twins often have different IQ test scores, yet such twins inherit the same genes. So environment must play some part in determining IQ. What do you think is the premise? Like, what are the reasons behind the author's argument? Do we have any? Uh, Anish, can we do that? Like can the participants participate or something like that, or it's just a monologue? Um, or is there a chat box or something where you guys can respond? I'll show the I'll show this again. You just unmute yourself. I don't know exactly how this works, but yeah. Okay. Anyways, so my point being that, let's say if you look at this first example, the one with the identical twins, um, there it says that basically the author's final argument is that environment plays a role in determining IQ. Right. Now, what are the reasons which the author gives? The author says that, okay, identical twins often have different IQ test scores, yet they inherit the same genes. So this is the reasoning part which the author has given, and that is your premise. Okay. Now, if you look at the very second example, which is like pretty simple, um, it says we'd better leave now. If we don't, then we might miss the flight. So the author is suggesting that we should leave now, and that's how generally um, your editorials and all are also like that, right? The authors give some suggestions, they give some recommendations. Now, what is recommendations based on? That's your premise. So why is the author suggesting that we should leave now? The author is doing that because if we don't, then we'll miss the flight. So that's what a premise is. Okay. So if you break an argument down, if you read any argument in any editorial opinion, whatever, you will always be able to, break it down into these two fundamental parts: premise and conclusion. See, these are very simple examples. Let's see if we can move on to some more complex ones. Uh, Also, I can't since I'm sharing my screen, I can't really see what you guys are doing in your chat box or something. Uh, so I'll just go ahead. I'll just keep checking the chat box once in a while. Uh, okay, so what we're going to do now is gonna give you a couple of tricks to identify premises, right? So if you spot these words, then the sentence which follows may most likely be a premise, right? The reason is that these kind of words, indicate some sort of some sort of facts, some sort of opinions. So let's say the word because XYZ happened, that's why I'm saying this. Simple things like that, right? So you can make a mental note of these like words, uh, click a screenshot, whatever. While reading passages, when you spot these words, try to make a mental note. Okay, oh, now we have a premise. Okay, so if let's say a question comes up which asks you to weaken something or strengthen something, you may have to go back to the premise. So these are indicator words, which are like very helpful in identifying what a premise is and identifying what a conclusion is. We'll come to conclusions later, but just take a note of these words, and I'll also tell you how you apply them while reading a passage. Okay, so let's take a look at this passage. Uh, I'll give you some time to read this. There's a passage from the Swaddle, and let me see this. Okay, okay. So take a note of this, and even here, uh, so you can figure out what the author is talking about. The author is talking about the DU elections, right? University elections, right? Now, can you? So I give you a list of indicator words. Do you see any indicator word in this passage per se? So if you read the fourth line from the bottom, it says, sorry, it says since the university elections are held in the national capital, they've always been closely followed. So the author's argument, if you look at just this passage, this paragraph, is that the DU elections have always been closely followed by a number of politicians and policymakers, uh, and etc. etc. And the reason is one of the reasons perhaps is that because they're held in the national capital, and we get to know that from the use of the word since. So the moment you see the word since, you can figure out that okay, we have a premise here, right? Okay, so I'll just move on. And this is in continuation of what I just told you, right? I hope you can read the next paragraphs of the passage. And see, so now the author is developing upon his argument. The author is basically saying that JNU and these two universities, well, to some extent, the student politics has become stagnant here, right? And then the author says that this is not the first time, but the situation is quite unique. So the author's argument is that the current situation of political stagnancy in these university elections is unique. That's the point which the author is trying to put across, right? Now, again, if you see in the third line, the word for is used. For one, the reason behind the non occurrence of these elections is rooted not in formalities, but in what appears to be administrative apathy. So the author is saying that this time, the premise of the author is that there is administrative apathy, and the conclusion is, in general, that the politics in these two universities has become stagnant. So that's the argument of the author. And we can spot this easily because we can see the word for. Now, what will usually happen in your CLAT paper is that they'll ask you to, let's say, weaken an argument made by the author. And if, let's say, there's an option which says that the administration was very actively involved in student elections, then that weakens or attacks the author's premise. That is why it's important to identify what a premise is and what a conclusion is, right? Because now you know that one of the reasons which the author is giving to support their conclusion is that there's administrative apathy. And if I attack this reason, then I'll be able to weaken the author's argument. So we'll revisit these concepts in when, let's say, we do the lecture uh, on weaken and strengthen. But for now, I want you to take note of how do you identify premises and how do you identify conclusions. All right. Okay. So since I can't like go back and check the chat box or anything. Once I'm done with the lecture, once I'm done speaking, I'll reserve like 5 to 10 minutes for answering your doubts or any other questions which you may have regarding what we've discussed today, right? So if you have any question, you may like just note them down or something. We can go back to the slides and check that out as well. All right. So yeah, just give me 1 second. Yeah, I'll just share the screen again. Okay. So now you learned how to identify premises. So what I've told you is what's the structure of a premise, how you can like these are a couple of indicator words which you can use while let's say identifying a premise in the passage. See, generally what you need to focus on is the concept of a premise. Once you get an understanding of what a premise is and how the argument of the author is proceeding, you don't really need indicator words. But for the sake of simplicity and now because you're starting out with your preparation, right, it's going to help you a lot if let's say whenever you read a passage you take a mental note of words like since. It's a very important word. uh, Words like for, they introduce a premise. So that's all on premises. Now we come to what is a conclusion. So conclusion is basically the crux of the author's argument, and it could be in the way of let's say, so you might read op-eds which say that the government should do this, the government should do that. These are all conclusions which the author is drawing on the basis of their premises. So let's say um, if the opinion is that there was the youth did not participate enthusiastically in the 2024 general elections, that's a claim which I'm giving. That's an opinion which I'm expressing. That's an argument which I'm trying to make. All those are my conclusions. Now, I may support that conclusion through premises, such as I might give, let's say, reports from all these civil societies and non-state actors, analyze the election commission data on what are the voting patterns for, let's say, the youth and let's say the other spectrums of the population. These are all. Uh, is there any question? Something? Okay. So these are all premises, right? And my conclusion that the youth is not enthusiastically participating is the argument which I'm trying to make, right? So again, the same structure: A leads to B, B leads to C. So A leads to C is my conclusion. This is something which the author is arriving at, right? So it's like that. See, facts. So what I told you about premises, like for premises, reasons, facts, data, it's already there. But using that data, using those reasons, using those findings, whatever is out there already, what conclusion, what argument am I trying to draw? Data by itself cannot make an argument, right? So I, as an author, need to use that data to make an argument. That is what a conclusion is, in simple words. Okay. So let's take a few examples. Now, since you've done premises as well, and you've done conclusions, I've just told you what conclusions are. Conclusion is basically any finding, any opinion which I'm arriving at, all of that. Let's take a look at these very three easy examples, right? There's a premise in each of them, and there's also a conclusion in each of them. Okay, so what I wanted to do is give them a read, try to identify where the conclusion is, and try to identify what are the reasons that the author has given to support that conclusion. Okay, so just take a look. Okay, so if you see the first example, it says they were a bad employee because they did not treat customers uh, with respect. Right? A very simple thing, a very simple statement. I'm basically expressing an opinion that they were a bad employee. It could be anyone. They were there. I'm just saying that they were bad. Right? Now, what's the reason which I'm giving? Because they did not treat their customers with respect. So everything after because becomes my premise, and my conclusion is they were a bad employee. It's that simple. Now, if you look at the Tokyo example, it's very easy to identify that my conclusion is therefore Tokyo is a rainy city. Now, why am I saying that Tokyo is a rainy city? Is because of the average rainfall each year. All right. Now, coming to the King of Great Britain example, what do you think is the premise and the conclusion here? See, the reason why the third example is important is because a lot of aspirants, a mistake which they do is they think that the premise in any argument or in any paragraph or passage, the starting few paragraphs are the premise and the latter few paragraphs are conclusions. That may generally be true, but that's not necessarily true, because I can state my conclusion or my main argument first and then tell you what my reasons are. So the King of Great Britain example is the best example to illustrate this. It tells you that the author thinks that the history of the kings of Great Britain is all about tyranny, right? That's the conclusion of the author, and that conclusion is supported by this proof that he refused to assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, and all of that. So his refusal to assent to these public good laws is the reason why the author is claiming that the King of Great Britain is a tyrant. I hope that makes sense, right? So my only point here being that don't be under this blind assumption that whatever comes in the first half of the argument is the premise and the latter half is always the conclusion. That's not the case. Okay. So yeah. Now again, we look at there are certain words which you can use to identify a conclusion in a passage. You may take a note of these. Therefore, so, as a result, hence, thus. These are very commonly used words which you'll come across even in, let's say, if you're reading the Hindu editorials, if you're reading anything from the newspaper. That's how the argument is structured. They'll talk about a lot of premises and they'll be like, therefore, I think this should be the case. Thus, this is happening in the country, right? So even in these previous examples, the Tokyo example, there's a clear use of the word therefore. Therefore, Tokyo is a rainy city. Okay, so these things, right? You can take a screenshot if you want. Uh, okay, let's do a passage. Try to identify the conclusions of the author in this passage with the help of the indicator words which I've told you.
का जो section है, it's coming under the purview of I.
Okay, so if you look at this, it's basically talking about how do you determine the physical side of the Anthropocene, right? And the conclusion of the author technically is, you notice the word does, right?
After rigorous process underway, that's the conclusion.
Yeah, there's a rigorous process underway, right? And why is the author coming to that conclusion? Because he gives a premise before that. The beginning marker of the Anthropocene as recorded in Earth's layers is not so easy to determine, which is why there's a voting process going on, or that there should be a voting process, whatever the case is, right? So if you look at the word thus, it introduces a conclusion, it introduces an argument, right? There's a rigorous process of voting underway to determine what is the golden spike. Okay. So this way, what see another important thing which you're doing here is you're simplifying the argument for yourself. Now, I'm not a science student, so I don't know what an anthropocene would be. What like the I don't know. Okay, whatever. Um, there's a lot of technical words used here, like anthropocene, what golden spike, blah blah blah. The point is that you don't need to get lost in these technicalities for the purpose of solving your paper. Okay, you only need to look at what is the logical argument which the author is making, which is why these indicator words are helpful, because they will definitely tell you that okay, if I see the word does, this is the conclusion of the author, and maybe before the conclusion, naturally the author must have given some reasons, and the reason is that it's not easy to determine. Okay, so that's the logic here. Take a look at this example as well. This is also very clear, no-brainer. You can see the word does, so you can immediately say that there is a need. So basically, the author's argument is his opinion or his suggestion is that there is a need for guidelines to strike a balance between equitable sharing of benefits, blah blah blah, and all of that, right? And the reason is because this a France 24 report. So on the basis of the findings of the France 24 report, whatever data has emerged from this report, that becomes our premise. And the inference or the conclusion which the author is drawing from all this report is that there is a need for guidelines. So notice how simply we've broken down a complex argument. There are a lot of words, blah blah blah, explorative relationship and everything, but for our purposes, we just know that the author's argument is that the author is advocating for a need for guidelines to strike a balance. That's it. Now, whatever we can strengthen, I need to do, it will be happen along these lines only, right? So that's the case. Um, okay. So now I hope this is clear, right? You can take a look at these indicator words again. This is the structure of a conclusion. Okay. After this, we move on to another very important topic, which is a counter premise. See, while I'm throwing these terms at you, premise, conclusion, counter premise, these terms by themselves don't matter so much. It's the underlying concept which I'm trying to tell you. My only objective is that the reason we're taking this lecture and not directly jumping into strength and weakness assumption is just to tell you how do you read a passage. What are the words? What are the statements where you need to focus on? that are important. So when we advise you as mentors, when we advise you to skim through a passage, what we mean is that you cannot miss out on the premise indicator words, you cannot miss out on the conclusion indicator words, and you can also not miss out on these counter premises. And what are these counter premise indicator words? So what happens in a counter premise is basically the author is saying XYZ is happening in the country, but ABC is also happening. Therefore, the government is not that bad. The the author might tell you that okay, the government, the state messed up these policies. However, the state policies in this, in let's say the e-commerce sector or the FDI sector are very good. They bring in business. They bring in like it promotes ease of doing business and all of that. Therefore, the government is doing all right. So you see a contradiction here. Earlier, the author is criticizing the government. Then they change their stance, and based on this changed stance, they arrive at a different conclusion. That is the objective of a counter premise, right? So counter premises are important because they give you the nuance of the passage. And this usually happens. Authors in general take a very balanced opinion, they're not very like, opinionated, right? They'll, if they're discussing the merits of a policy, they'll also discuss the demerits of the policy. And this contrast is usually presented through counter premises, which is why it's important to identify them, because if you don't identify them, you'll only see one side of the story, you'll not see the other side of the story. Okay? I hope that makes some sense. Now, even if you do not understand counter premises particularly, what I just need you guys to focus on is these kind of words. Whenever these words are there in the passage, and mind you, they will always be however, but are very common words to use. Be very cautious and carefully read the sentences which follows after that, because the author might be, let's say, appreciating a particular policy in 4 5 lines, but the moment they introduce a counter premise, you know that the author's stance is changing. Now there may be another counter premise to a counter premise, like the author may go back to his original stand again, and that is why it's important to make note of the nuances of all of these arguments, right? So you may take a screenshot of this if you want. And by the way, these indicator words which I've told you, these lists are not exhaustive. There may be a lot of other words which I've not written down here, but they're just helpful to understand the concept. And I picked up the most commonly used ones. Okay. Right. So let's take a look at these examples. And through this, I hope the concept of a counter premise would be clear. Just give me a minute, I'll be back while you guys can look at your work. Um, someone unmuted themselves. Can you please mute yourself? Better. Okay. So, 1 second. Can you uh, can you please mute yourself? Uh, okay. Let me proceed anyway. All right. Um, yeah. Right. So let's just take a look at these examples. Uh, it says, let's focus on the first example. Some people clean up potato chips as a gateway to junk food, leading to consumption of more junk food, blah, blah, blah. So the author's initial position is potato chips lead to more junk food and all of that. However, this is clearly not the case. So now you notice the reason why the word however is important because it's changing the position of the author. Initially, the paragraph conveys that the opinion of the author is against potato chips. But the moment the word however is used, you know that now the author's stand is going to change. So now the author talks about, in addition, people love potato chips and they're a great source of potassium. So we should serve potato chips at all our events. So basically, you see a counter premise here, which is that potato chips are a great source of potassium. And based on that, the conclusion of the author uh, is that we should serve them at all our events. So you see, so you can notice the word however, and that is introducing the counter premise. You can also notice the word so, and so is the word which introduces conclusions. All right. Now we come to the next example. The next example says that it is true that laws that would make it illegal to harm pet would make the lives of our pets much easier, right? So the author initially shows some sort of support for laws which make it illegal to harm a pet. Now, when you notice the word but, that tells you that now the author's position is going to slightly alter, right? The author is saying that, okay, I agree that making it illegal to harm our pets is a good way to go about things. But that is not the purpose of a legal system, right? So this is where the nuance of the author comes into picture. So the reason why counter premises are important is because they give you a very nuanced understanding of what the author is saying, right? Initially, the author is like, okay, yeah, it's fine, make it illegal to harm our pets, but then the author introduces a nuance that there are other ways to do it. So it may be a good way to illegalize harming pets, but that's not the best way to go about things. That's the crux of the author's argument, and you're able to understand that because you know that there's a counter premise operating here. Okay, so I gave you this in the starting itself. Why is it important to identify the premises and conclusions to get the, so basically you'll get the central idea, main argument questions as well. Now, if you can keep a track of the premises and conclusions of the author, you'll get a good picture of what the passage is entirely about. What are the nuances of the author? What is the kind of position which the author is taking? Are they going in one extreme direction? Are they taking a very moderate position? Or are they going in another extreme direction? Right? And it goes without saying it's very important for solving strengthen, weaken, and assumption questions. All right. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Uh, so we solved a couple of. So the thing is that this lecture is largely to build a base, to build a concept. We've not solved any questions, let's say, directly from CLAT, because CLAT does not directly ask you questions on premises and conclusions. All right. But it will ask you strengthen, weaken, and assumption questions. So going forward, in our lectures, when we do these topics, we will cover concepts from this class, this lecture, and we use them to solve questions which CLAT has actually asked in the past year papers and all of that. All right. So that's how it's gonna go. I'll stop sharing my screen now and I'll just come to the chat box. Let's see if you have any doubts. Uh, so, Arya, yes. I mean, it's not necessary that all the lines in a passage are like a premise or a conclusion or a counter premise. There are a lot of passages which, let's say, give you a lot of background information. So, it's not necessarily like a premise or something, but it's just information. Like, let's say I'm talking about Indian electoral politics. So I'll give you an idea of okay, how many national parties are there, what is the social political history of Indian politics. So all of this is not a premise; it's just background information which I'm giving you to give you more context. So in passages which you'll read, there will be a lot of these things where what you're actually reading is just context, and that context building is important because so that you better understand the passage as well, right? So that's the whole idea. Uh, I'll just can I skip reading the passage? See, it depends on what you mean by skip, Sagar. Like, obviously, you can't skip the entire passage, but like, what your uh, way to go about it could be like you don't read each and every line, which is why I've told you that these are a couple of words which you need to look out for, a couple of sentences, statements you need to look out for that are important. So, whatever I told you just now about, let's say, background information or context, you can generally skip that because context, well, questions will not be based on context. Questions will not be based on background information which the author has given. They'll be based on the argument of the author, right? So you can skip reading those things, but apart from that, you have to like make a note of like what is the premise, what is the conclusion, etc. Right? Will you recommend solving GMAT and LSAT? I personally would, yes. Solving GMAT and LSAT questions is important. The reason is that, see, whatever concepts I've told you, they're very clearly tested in GMAT questions, right? And Sagar, the reason I've not put up questions at this stage is because this is a very foundational lecture. Just to tell you guys what these concepts are. There won't be any direct question in CLAT ever about what is the premise, what is the conclusion, nothing like that, right? So yes, I would recommend Soumya to solve GMAT and LSAT questions. It's very good. Right approach for solving CR marks. So see, CR passages are small, right? They're not very lengthy passages compared to like English and legal reasoning. So one way to go about it is like, let's see, there are two ways. Some people, what they do is they read the questions first and then read the passage. The other thing is that you read the passage and then arrive at the question. So whatever works with you, right? But yeah, what my entire point about behind this exercise was just to tell you that what are the important things which you need to focus on while you're solving critical reasoning questions, and what you can basically avoid. Let's say in like, I mean, in the sense that you don't have to read unnecessary details. All right. So yeah, which source should I use for CR? I mean, I would recommend GMAT questions. Like, it's a good way to go about it. Um, CR. What is the score in CR considering CLAT is in 5 months? 5 months is a long time, Krishna, so don't worry about your score as of yet. Um, I would say at least like, so your CR is what, like around 24 marks, right? Yeah. So Krishna, the next lecture I think is going to be about main point, central thesis, and all of these. How do you draw inferences? These kind of questions. But yeah, so yeah, just to answer you, Krishna, like I think an ideal score as of now would be like around like 15, maybe 14, 15 out of 24, right? Depends on like what stage you are of your preparation. 18 is a good score, I would say, Akansha, but again, that also depends on the quality of the mark and all of those factors. So, yeah, black confidence. Uh, Sagar, then see the way to go about it is like, I mean, be thorough with your analysis. Like, once you do a CR worksheet, let's say, whatever questions you get wrong, try to figure out why you've gotten them wrong, what concept you were incorrectly applying, maybe, and also figure out what questions you got right. Okay, so I think the key there is like having a very calm and composed way of analyzing your answers. Once you're done with solving the paper, once you have the answer key, analyze them, sit down with yourself, try to make note of what went wrong, what went right, what reasoning did you apply which went wrong, what reason did you apply which went right, and what's the correct way to go about things. Okay. Uh, can you 18 is good to go? Yes. It's fine. I mean, you still have 5 months. 10 is not a problem. Okay. Okay, yeah, Manish, that's an interesting question. See, that's again an important point because see, because these passages are long, there may be multiple conclusions which the author is drawing, and this becomes important when you're solving main point questions or what is the main point of the author, what is the purpose of the author, and all of that. When you're solving those kind of questions, uh, it's important to see what is the general idea of the question of the passage, right? So within a passage, I may see that okay, I think you should do A, I think you should do B, I think you should do C, but you need to keep all these small conclusions together, and then let's say figure out something in the larger picture. That's the way I used to go about it, at least. Like, if you're able to identify some smaller conclusions, they will always tie back to something. They will always tie back to something in broader. They will always tie back to some broad scope of the passage, right? Some broad argument which the author is making. So try to think of it that way, if that makes sense. English writing, I didn't get you, Sagar. Could you like elaborate what do you mean by English writing? Um, Shreyans, can you come again? Like how to approach flaw questions, like flawed reasoning questions, those kind of things. Okay, so flawed reasoning is a separate topic in itself. All right. So there are like some fallacies which you commit when you're making an argument. Like uh, there's a very famous one: post hoc, ergo propter hoc, and all these things. I mean, I won't discuss them here just to confuse you or anything. But those are the flawed questions. So for that, basically, you need to figure out, like conceptually, you need to be clear with what are the different kinds of flawed reasonings which we come across generally, right? So okay, sure, Monisha. I'll display those slides again. Um, yeah, main idea questions are because of the reason that sometimes the problem with main idea questions is that your scope cannot be too narrow, your scope cannot be too wide. The author will discuss multiple points. You need to select such an option which most comprehensively covers all the points which the author has discussed. So this is somewhat related to the main conclusion wala question which I was discussing, that there may be multiple small conclusions, but then what is the main conclusion which we are arriving at, right? So that's where the main idea thing is important. Um, okay, I have a problem with the economics passages in general. So CR and 4. See, even if it's an economics passage, uh, it's going to be like one or two at best, right? So even if let's say you're able to um, sort of like devote a lot of time there, it's not a problem as long as you're able to buck up some time. Let's say easier passages, which are like, let's say, social passages, political passages. They're like easy to solve, right? You're welcome, everyone. So yeah, and even in economics passages, I would advise you to do general readings about economics, in the sense that be, I think, clear with concepts like inflation, supply demand, how does it work, how does the economy work in these, like when these variables change, like what is the effect of taxation and all of that. So if you have some background knowledge of these concepts, I think economics topics help. But as far as reading the passage is concerned, economics topic have a lot of technical terms and like a lot of data. But as I told you, data per se is not relevant for us as long as we're able to gauge what the argument of the author is. And in economics passages, the argument is very clear, like they're recommending a policy change or something like that. Or they're saying that, okay, this is a bad policy, or you could run something else. So as long as you're able to figure out the main argument, don't get lost in the details of an economics passage. All right. Uh, yeah. Priya, I would say that if that's the case, try doing your sectional again. Like once you've done it, great, you know your score. Do it again. Same thing. Because when you do that, it sort of gives you a good idea about where you went wrong, where you went right. And in addition to that, maybe if you guys are like into group studies or something, try to sit down with a friend and with their help try to analyze a section. I think that helps. They'll be able to point out the reasoning flaws which you are making, and perhaps they are not doing those same flaws, right? uh, any question which you have with respect to what we've covered in the lecture today? I hope the concept of premise and conclusion is clear, uh, right? Okay. How much time is needed to increase my attempts? See, increasing attempts is like a long, short goal, in my opinion. For now, focus on increasing your accuracy. So even if you're attempting less questions, try to make them as accurate as possible. Attempts increase sort of naturally and sort of organically as well, right? So that's important. I should start to find conclusion with strategy data gaming. See, Fizza, whenever economics passages are giving you static data, it won't just be data. They will make an observation based on that data. They will make an argument on the basis of that data, and that is your conclusion. So I can talk about, okay, the the democracy index, India is ranked here. Then this journal said this about India. Then these are the reports and all of that. This is all data which I'm giving you, let's say. Or in economics terms, let's say I can tell you, okay, the RBI issued this these statistical reports. The ease of doing business report ranked us here. This is all data which I'm giving you, right? But on the basis of data, I will make an argument. I will make an observation. I will say that because of this, perhaps India should do XYZ things, right? That is how you spot a conclusion. So don't get lost in data too much. Okay. See, Satya, in a passage, in a long passage, the distinction between a premise and a conclusion may not always be watertight. But as long as you're able to make some sense of, in general, see, ask yourself this: what is the point which the author is trying to convey? And what are the reasons that the author is given to support their point? These are the only two things which you need to figure out from a passage. Once you've done that, great. Okay. So there may be multiple reasons which the author is given, then there may be like less reasons or something like that. But that's the general way to go about it. So don't worry too much like you're unable to figure out what a premise is, what a conclusion is, or anything like that. But I think the words, the indicator words which I've told you, they might be helpful in doing exactly this. All right. So yeah. Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll just share my slides again. And if any one of you missed out on like clicking some screenshots, whatever, you can do that. All right. Let's go back. Yeah. So I'll show you the indicator words. So these are the words for a premise, right? And when you go back home, whenever go back home as in when you try solving any other sectional test or mock or reading any passage in the future, try to spot these words. And I'm sure they will improve your understanding of that passage, right? And that's the whole point of this exercise, so that you know how to break down a passage. Okay, I think uh, that should conclude things. Krishna, can you elaborate? Like, I didn't get you. Like, concept portions clear, but understanding lacks. So, what's it for me? Uh, Priya, it's up to you. I mean, for me, it helped. See, because the way I did my passages in CLAT was like I read the passage first and then I went back to the questions. So when I was reading the question, I had to refer back to the passages to figure out a couple of things. So I found it helpful to annotate things. So sure, you can do that. And this question about reading the passage first or reading the question first is like a very personal preference based question. So try to experiment with your strategies, whatever you can come up with. That'll be great. All right. So yeah, you'll have to experiment a little bit. How much did I practice CR daily? It's been long, but I think I did at least one worksheet every day or at least every 2 days. Worksheet of let's say 10 to 20 questions. So that was my consistency before that. Okay, I get it, Krishna. Mm, Maybe okay if that's the case. Try try working on your time management a bit, right? And maybe it's the time thing which make pressurizes you, which you rush through the passage. But if you sit down for the passage with a cool mind, you're able to understand better. So you have to figure out how do you tackle with that time aspect of while reading a passage. Okay, because you need to understand things in a speeded manner, right? You can't spend a lot of time reading just one passage. That's not going to help. uh, okay, I think that's all for today. I hope there are no more doubts. We'll meet. Hopefully, we'll meet very soon with another session. We'll perhaps take up inferences on main point. All right. Um, I hope this session was helpful to let's like if you've not like gone through these concepts before. All right, and I hope like the takeaway of this class is after this you like try to apply these concepts while you're reading any passage in your leisure reading or whatever, right? Try to figure out where the premise is, where the conclusion is, and this is going to help you out in understanding the passage as a whole. All right, so I hope yes, that's it. We can cut. Thank you so much, everyone.